Okay, as we begin our class and begin our Animal Science 302 beef production class, I want to give you an overview of kind of what the beef industry looks like and how some changes have happened over time as the United States was settled, and then how beef industry began to evolve over time and all the way up into where we are today. And so we're going to spend some time today looking at the structure of the beef industry in Texas and across the United States, and again, see how it's evolved over time. The interesting thing is, as we look at agriculture today, as we compare it back to the 1800s, back in the 1800s, we had over 70% of the country or the individuals involved in agricultural production, so the production side. And as we've changed over time now, and technology has been adopted, now about 5% or less of the population of the United States is actually involved in production agriculture. And so that's an exciting time because we've been able to take the technology that we've developed over the years in agriculture in general and improvements in that, along with machinery and other factors, and improvement in productivity and genetics and everything else, we are able to produce more with less people as well as less land resources as well. So that's the interesting thing that we have been able to do. And then as a result of that, farm output over time, so instead of 70% of the population producing the food, now we're down to 5%. So we would expect that our farms and ranches would have to increase the output as well. And so we've seen that over time. Our farm output and in actual production and revenue has continued to climb and increase over time in the billions of dollars today. And so as we look at how the beef industry has evolved over time and some of the changes that we have, when we look at the historic uses of cattle, we go back to early times and ancient times. Cattle were mainly utilized for work purposes. They were used for draft. And so they were used to help them farm the land. They were used to help them build things, to transport goods, transport materials, maybe even just transportation in general for humans. And so they were used as draft purposes during that time. And then as those animals, as we looked at what happened to those animals after their days of draft, so their life was, they were no longer able to be used as draft. We talk about sustainability today. Back then, they utilized everything. And so when we had an animal that just could not any longer be used for draft, then that animal was turned into meat. And so the animal was harvested, and we utilized the meat products to consume and eat as nourishment, but then we also utilized the hide and leather to make leather for clothing and other goods as well. So first and foremost, early on, the cattle were utilized for draft purposes, and then it began to change. And so again, we used them as draft, but then we also utilized those animals in milk production. And so they provided milk for the families. And then again, once they became no longer able to milk or reproduce, then they were turned into meat and hides. But as times have changed and as society has progressed and we become more efficient and there's less people involved in production agriculture, one of the ways that we have been able to increase our output of total food per farm is to become more specialized in whatever we may be. And so we no longer use in the United States really animals for draft because we do have machinery and other options for that. But the other thing that has changed is now we have specialized breeds of cattle for either milk or beef production. And so we have our specific set of cattle that may be heavier muscled, that are going to produce more beef product. They're going to be specifically for the beef industry. The other side of the industry is the milk industry. And so we've got animals that are really specialized for milk production. And so those cattle may not be as heavy muscled and may not produce as much yield per carcass because they're usually utilizing those nutrients for milk production. Now, at the end of the lifetime of those cows, they will in turn be turned into beef and their hides to leather. But then we also have the offspring of those animals, the steers, the bull calves, that are not utilized on the dairy, those animals will go into the beef production as well. And some of that is beginning to change with the use of sex semen and other technology on the dairy side, so there's not as many of those bull calves that are produced that are going into the beef industry. So our industry's changed a lot. So now we have specifically a milk industry, and now we have a beef cattle industry, and we become really specialized with that. And so as we look at when cattle came in and some specific importations, of course we had the bison or the buffalo that were roaming and that are still out there, but that was the main beef animal. And so we saw some major importations over time when Columbus came on his second voyage, Cortez's invasion of Mexico, we saw some infusion of cattle. In 1521, Ponce de Leon in Florida brought in some cattle. Then in 1624, we had the Plymouth colony. And then in 1783, we had what we called the England's best were imported to Maryland. And it's thought that that was maybe the first of today's breeds of cattle. So the British breeds that were brought in, including the Durham or the Shorthorn, would have been in 1783. And then we continued to see those importations of those breeds, and we'll talk about those specific breeds later on in the class as we get into the breeds of cattle. But then in another importation of a different type of cattle, our Bos Indicus type breeds, was in 1835, and it was our Indian cattle that were brought into South Carolina. So those were some major importations of cattle that came in that really began to lay the foundation of the beef cattle industry today. And so oftentimes we talk about, and we'll really get into this later on in the class, where we talked about the United States is the melting pot of the human people, because as we settled the United States, we had people of all different descents from all over the world that came here. And we see the same thing with cattle. We were able to import cattle, different breeds of cattle from all over the world that had different production possibilities, and some were very heavy muscled and lean, and maybe some were higher marbling, maybe some were adapted to southern climates, and we were able to bring those cattle in to the United States, those breeds of cattle, to begin adapting them to the different environments and then the different production goals. And so that's the neat thing that our beef industry is founded on, is we're kind of the melting pot of cattle, and we use that to our advantage to help improve the overall production and efficiency of cattle. Then we saw a change in the industry a little bit as we began to see the industrialization of the United States, and we began to see that shift of people moving from production agriculture. And so everybody having a cow and a chicken and hog and producing their own food, to where we began to shift the population to more into the industrial revolution there. And so now we had people that were becoming more specialized in producing food for other people as well. And so we began to see this change over time. And one of the things that we saw was movement of cattle. And we saw in the 1800s the Texas cattle drives. And we've seen the movies like Lonesome Dove and some of the other great westerns where they talked about the great cattle drives and what they were. And those cattle drives were about driving cattle to market or driving them to additional forage resources, nutrient resources, to fatten those cattle up. And so we had some gold drives in 1850s that we drove large numbers of cattle out to California during the gold rush era. The Civil War disrupted the cattle drives for a period of time. And then as we moved into the late 1800s after the Civil War, we began to see those cattle drives picked up. And then by the late 1880s, we began to see those diminish with time. And some of that is because of some things that happened in history, land ownership, fragmentation of land, but also the invention of the barbed wire changed things, where we began to, instead of just free grazing cattle, we had actual more confinement of the cattle with that. And so we saw the cattle drives that happened over time. Then we began to see, as we get into the late 1800s, we began to see cattle, instead of just only being fed forages or grazing, we began to see farmers that were producing grain crops began to own cattle, and to feed that cattle their own grain to add value to that commodity, to the grain commodity. And we call those farmer feeders. So we began to see those pop up in the Corn Belt in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where we had all of these farmer feeders. And then by the 1950s, we began to see some large commercial feed yards pop up, and believe it or not, in California is where they began to start. And so we had these large feed yards that became developed there and started up in California. And then as we moved into the 1960s, we really saw the development of the feeding industry in the panhandle of Texas and into the Midwest as well. So we began to see cattle being finished out in these commercial feed yards. And as we move through the semester, we'll talk a little bit about the feeding industry and the feed yards in Texas and across the United States.